Welcome to Creepy Horror Tales. I'm so glad you're here. This channel is your go-to spot for spine-chilling stories that thrill and captivate. While our tales may be scary and spooky, they're also perfect for those moments when you want to relax and embrace a little excitement. So, settle in, let the eerie atmosphere wash over you, and enjoy the delightful chills that await. Do you ever get that feeling like you're not supposed to be somewhere, like every cell in your body is just screaming at you to turn back? That's what hit me the moment I pulled up to that old house. I know it sounds cliche, but I swear it felt different this time, and I've seen some messed up stuff in my line of work. Let me back up for a second. My name's Jamie, and I work as a freelance crime scene cleaner. It's not exactly glamorous, but it pays the bills. I started doing this after a rough patch in my life. And to be honest, I kind of like the quiet. There's something calming about the repetitive motions, about putting things back in order, even if it's for someone else. I've always had a bit of a fascination with true crime, and maybe that's why this kind of job made sense for me. I thought I'd seen it all, but that house had changed things. I got the call at around 10 p.m. The dispatcher said it was urgent, one of those rush jobs where they needed the place clean before morning. When I asked what happened, she said something about multiple incidents and police cleared the scene. That was it. I didn't think much of it. Figured it was just another bad day for someone else. But as I drove closer, I noticed the street was darker than usual, like the street lights didn't reach that far. And the house, man, it just sat there, hunched over like it was trying to swallow itself. It was an old, crumbling Victorian, surrounded by overgrown bushes and dense woods on all sides. The paint was peeling off the walls, and the windows were boarded up. The air felt thick, almost like it was hard to breathe, but I figured that was just my mind playing tricks on me. I've cleaned worse places, I told myself. But the smell hit me before I even reached the front steps, metallic like copper, mixed with something foul that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just decay. It was something else entirely. Inside, the place was a mess. I'm used to gore, but this was different. There were these symbols on the walls, drawn in what looked like blood. They weren't like anything I'd seen before, sort of twisted and uneven, like they didn't belong in this world. I could feel something in the air, a heaviness pressing down on me as I started to work. My gloves stuck to the walls as I scrubbed at the stains, and for a moment, I could have sworn I felt the walls pulse beneath my hands, like they were alive. About an hour in, I found the trapdoor. It was half hidden under a rotting rug, in the middle of what used to be the living room. I wasn't exactly keen on the idea of going down there, but I'm thorough, and I don't leave a job half done. Besides, I figured it was just an old cellar. I was wrong. The cellar was pitch black, the kind of dark that swallows the light from your flashlight. The air was even thicker down there, like breathing through a wet cloth. As I stepped inside, the smell got worse, almost unbearable. There were more symbols on the walls. Only these seemed older, like they'd been there for years. Then in the corner I saw it. It was a small statue, maybe a foot tall, perched on a cracked stone pedestal. It looked like some sort of creature, human-like, but with twisted limbs and a face that seemed almost alive. Its eyes stared back at me, and I swear, for a moment, they glistened like they were wet. I don't know why I did it, but I reached out and touched the thing. The second my fingers brushed against it, I felt this jolt, like an electric shock, and everything around me went dark. When I came to, I was lying on the cellar floor. I don't know how long I'd been out, but my flashlight was still on, and the statue was just sitting there, watching me. I got up, dusted myself off, and decided to get out of that cellar. As I climbed back up the stairs, I noticed a shadow move out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but when I turned, I saw it. A figure standing at the bottom of the steps, its outline barely visible in the darkness. I bolted up the stairs and slammed the trapdoor shut, my heart racing. I told myself it was just a trick of the light. But as I continued cleaning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist whenever I wasn't looking directly at them. And the whispers, God, the whispers. I kept hearing this faint voice, like someone calling my name, but it was never clear enough to tell where it was coming from. I finished the job as quickly as I could and got the hell out of there. But even after I left, things didn't feel right. That night, I had the most vivid nightmares. It was like I was back in that cellar, but this time, the statue was moving, crawling toward me. I could hear that same whisper, only now it was louder. And it was saying things I couldn't understand, like a language that didn't belong to this world. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. I'd hear scratching at my door in the middle of the night, and every time I turned on the lights, there'd be nothing there. I started seeing it everywhere. The statue. I'd catch glimpses of it in reflections, in the corners of dark rooms, always just out of reach. It felt like it was waiting for me to acknowledge it, like it needed me to believe in it to fully come through. I did some research, hoping to find some kind of explanation. That's when I stumbled upon stories about a cult from the early 1900s that supposedly practiced dark rituals in that very house. They believed in summoning entities for power, using objects to bind them to this world. I found pictures of the symbols from the house. They were used for invoking spirits, or worse. The more I read, the more I realized I'd messed up. That thing wasn't just a statue. It was some kind of vessel. And by touching it, I had awakened whatever was trapped inside. I knew I had to do something before it got worse. I found an old forum post about a ritual to banish entities, but it was vague and there were no guarantees it would work. It mentioned using salt, fire, and reciting some phrases in Latin. It didn't sound like much, but it was the only lead I had. So I went back to the house one last time, hoping I wasn't already too late. The moment I stepped inside, it felt different, like the whole place was breathing. I made my way to the cellar and set everything up, the salt, the candles, the matches. I started reciting the words, my voice trembling as I spoke. The air grew colder, and I could feel this pressure building in the room, like something was pushing against me. Then, everything went haywire. The candles flickered out, objects flew off the shelves, and the shadows began to close in. I kept chanting, my voice hoarse, as I sprinkled salt around the statue. The room seemed to pulse, like it was about to collapse in on itself. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The shadows receded, the air lightened, and the cellar felt empty. I thought I'd done it. I really did. But here's the thing, when I got home, I heard it again. That whisper. It was so faint, but it was there just behind me calling my name. And now, every night, I hear it a little bit clearer. I don't know if it's real or if my mind's just cracked, but I'm scared to find out. Because deep down, I know that whatever I did in that house, it wasn't enough. I started leaving the lights on in every room. It didn't matter that my electric bill was going to be ridiculous. I needed to see everything. Even the shadows. Especially the shadows. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom because it was the darkest spot in the house. I kept imagining I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see that damn statue sitting at the foot of my bed. So, I moved into the living room, slept on the couch with the TV on for background noise. But even then, the whispers didn't stop. Some nights, I'd hear faint scratching, like nails scraping against wood, always seeming to come from inside the walls. Other times, I'd hear footsteps shuffling across the floor above me, even though I knew no one else was in the house. But the worst was the whispering. It started getting louder, more frequent, like whoever or whatever it was starting to find its voice. And every time I heard it, it said my name, only it wasn't quite right. There was this strange cadence to it, almost like it was trying to mimic the way a person would say it, but failing. It was as if a voice I'd never heard before was trying to speak a language it didn't quite understand. I thought about calling someone, a friend, a family member, maybe even a priest, but I didn't want anyone else involved. This was my mess, and I had to clean it up. Besides, how could I explain something like this? How could I tell them I brought something home with me from that cursed house? Something that didn't belong in this world. It didn't help that I kept seeing it. No matter where I went, that statue would show up. It was never close, but it was always there, lingering just at the edge of my vision. Once, I saw it in the reflection of my bathroom mirror. It was standing behind me, right outside the doorway. But when I spun around, the hallway was empty. Another time, I caught a glimpse of it in the window of a passing car as I was crossing the street. It was like a sick game of hide and seek, and I was losing my mind trying to keep up. One night, I woke up to the sound of something heavy scraping across the floor. It came from the kitchen. I lay there on the couch, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing. I didn't want to move, didn't want to see what had made that noise. But then it came again, another long, dragging scrape. It was like metal against tile. I forced myself to sit up, every muscle in my body screaming for me to stay put, to just pretend I didn't hear it. But I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. When I got to the kitchen, it was empty. At least, that's what I thought at first. But then I noticed the salt shaker lying on the floor in the middle of the room, salt scattered everywhere. It was as if someone had swept their hand across the counter and knocked it off deliberately. The salt had formed a line leading straight to the basement door. I hadn't been down there since I'd returned from the old house. I didn't want to be reminded of that place, but now it was like the cellar was calling me back, like I'd left something unfinished. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob. It felt cold, too cold. I opened the door, and that familiar smell hit me again, the smell from the house. Only this time it was stronger, more pungent. I almost gagged. I fumbled around for the light switch, and as the bare bulb flickered on, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There at the bottom of the stairs was the statue. It was sitting right in the middle of the floor, perched on an old wooden crate that I didn't even remember bringing down there. Its eyes seemed to follow me as I descended the steps. I don't know how it got there. I don't even know if it ever left. But there it was, waiting for me, like it knew I'd come back eventually. I didn't know what to do. I was too scared to touch it again, but I couldn't just leave it there. So, I grabbed an old blanket from the corner and threw it over the thing. I couldn't stand to look at it anymore. I went back upstairs, bolted the basement door, and shoved a chair in front of it for good measure. But even with that, I didn't feel safe. If it could follow me once, what was stopping it from doing it again? The days blurred together after that. I stopped going to work, stopped taking jobs. I couldn't leave the house for more than a few minutes because I was terrified of what I might come back to. I was eating less, sleeping less. The bags under my eyes were permanent now, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Then came the night everything changed. I was lying on the couch, just staring at the ceiling, too exhausted to sleep, but too scared to move. The TV was playing some late-night infomercial that I wasn't really watching. Then suddenly, the screen went black. The power didn't go out. It was just the TV. At first, I thought it had just died on me, but then the whispering started again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the TV. The screen flickered, and for a brief second, I saw an image of the cellar. My cellar. The statue was there, only it wasn't still anymore. It was moving. Its limbs bending and twisting in ways that shouldn't be possible. The screen flickered again, and then it was gone. The infomercial was back, as if nothing had happened. I bolted up from the couch, grabbed my car keys, and headed straight for the door. I needed to get out to put some distance between me and whatever was happening in that house. But just as I reached for the handle, I heard a voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, like someone standing right behind me. It said, "Come back to me, Jamie." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't recognize the voice, but it had this strange familiarity, like I'd heard it 1,000 times before in my nightmares. Slowly, I turned around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't leave that night. I couldn't bring myself to step outside, but I knew I couldn't stay there either. Not unless I wanted to lose what little sanity I had left. The next day, I packed a bag and drove out to a cheap motel on the edge of town. I needed time to think, to figure out what to do next. For a few days, the motel seemed safe. There were no whispers, no shadows lurking in the corners, and no signs of that cursed statue. I started to think maybe I'd outrun it, or maybe I was just losing my mind back at the house and there was nothing to run from in the first place. But just as I started to relax, the whispers found me again. It was a little after midnight, and I just turned off the lights to try and get some sleep. As I lay there, I heard it, soft at first like a breath against my ear. Then it grew louder, more distinct, until I could make out the words. "Jamie, Jamie, come back." I turned on the light, my pulse racing. I didn't know what to do anymore. I was running out of options. That's when I remembered something I'd read in one of those old forum posts. There was a mention of a place, a site where the cult used to gather, deep in the woods not far from the house. It was rumored to be some kind of ritual ground. I didn't know if going there would help, but it was the only lead I had left. The next day, I drove out to the woods. It was a foggy morning, and the road was barely visible. I parked the car at the end of a dirt path and hiked the rest of the way. I didn't have a map, but I just kept walking, following this strange pull like I was being guided. The deeper I went, the darker it got, even though the sun was still up. It was like the trees were closing in on me, blocking out the light. Eventually, I found it. A clearing with an old stone altar in the center, covered in moss and surrounded by a ring of ancient trees. The place felt wrong, like the air itself was heavier here. I approached the altar, half expecting to see that statue waiting for me. But there was nothing there, just a carved stone slab with those same symbols etched into its surface. I didn't know what to do next, so I did the only thing I could think of. I started to speak, to call out to whatever was following me. I don't know why I thought it would work, but I was desperate. I told it to leave me alone, to go back to wherever it came from. But as I spoke, I felt this sudden pressure in my chest, like something was squeezing my lungs. The air grew colder, and the whispers came back, louder this time, like a chorus surrounding me. Then I saw it, the statue. It was standing on the altar now, its eyes locked on me, and for the first time, I saw it really move. Its head tilted slightly, and its mouth opened, as if it was trying to speak. And that's when I heard it, not just trying to speak, but actually saying something. The voice that came out was not a whisper anymore. It was a low, guttural sound, echoing across the clearing, as if it was being spoken by a dozen different mouths at once. I couldn't understand the words. It wasn't English. It wasn't even a language I could place. But there was something in the tone, a kind of ancient malevolence that made my skin crawl. I took a step back, and that's when the statue's limbs started to shift, cracking and popping as they bent at impossible angles. It was as if the thing was shedding its stone skin, revealing something alive underneath. I could see its eyes now, gleaming wet and black, as they seemed to widen and narrow, focusing on me with a kind of hungry intelligence. Its mouth, still open, began to twist into what I can only describe as a grin too wide for its face. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a tree root, and I hit the ground hard. The breath rushed out of my lungs as I lay there, staring up at the thing. It had climbed down from the altar and was standing over me, its limbs impossibly long and thin, like it was stretching out of some nightmare dimension. The grin never left its face. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet and bolted back into the woods. The trees seemed to close in as I ran, the branches clawing at my clothes, pulling at my skin. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to get as far away from that place as possible. But the whispering had returned, louder and clearer than ever. And this time, it wasn't just my name. I could hear it laughing, this sick, mocking laughter that seemed to come from all around me. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the tree line and back onto the dirt path where I'd left my car. I jumped in, slammed the door, and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I tore out of there, not daring to look back in the rearview mirror. But even as I drove away, I could still feel it. That same heaviness in the air, the same oppressive presence lingering around me. It was like I'd brought something out of the woods with me, something that wasn't going to let me go. I kept driving, aimlessly, just wanted to put as much distance between myself and that clearing as possible. But after about 20 minutes, I realized I wasn't getting any further away from it. The trees outside the window still looked the same, gnarled, twisted shapes draped in fog, like they were reaching out to drag me back. The road felt endless, looping back on itself. I knew I was going in circles, but I didn't know how. The GPS on my phone wasn't working, just static on the screen. I was trapped, lost in some kind of nightmare loop. I finally pulled over, my heart pounding in my ears, and tried to catch my breath. As I sat there in the car, I noticed something in the woods ahead, a faint glow, almost like firelight, flickering between the trees. I knew I shouldn't have gone toward it, but I was out of options. So, I got out and walked slowly toward the light, half expecting to see the statue waiting for me again. As I approached, I realized it wasn't fire. It was an old lantern, hanging from a crooked tree branch. The light was dim and sickly, casting long shadows across the ground. Beneath the lantern, there was a stone circle, similar to the one at the clearing, only smaller. Inside it lay something that made my blood run cold. It was a pile of old, tattered clothing, clothes that didn't look like they belonged to any one person. They were different styles, different sizes, some old-fashioned and others more modern, all mixed together like a patchwork of discarded lives. There were also small objects scattered around, watches, keys, faded photographs, trinkets that people might carry on them. The kind of things that wouldn't be left behind on purpose. I knew, deep down, that these were the remnants of the people who had come here before me. People who had also stumbled into whatever this place was and hadn't found their way out. I could feel something watching me from the darkness beyond the lantern's glow. And for a moment, I thought I saw movement just at the edge of the light, a figure slipping between the trees. But it was gone before I could get a good look. That's when I heard the voice again. It was right behind me, close enough that I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. "You're almost there, Jamie." It was a different voice this time, soft and cold, like a child's whisper. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the darkness, stretching out endlessly in every direction. I turned back toward the lantern, but the light had started to fade. The world seemed to darken around me, closing in like a tightening noose. I ran back to the car, desperate to get out of those woods. But when I got there, the car was gone, vanished. It was as if I had never parked it there to begin with. That was when the fog started to roll in thick and heavy, swirling around me and swallowing everything. I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Panic gripped me again, but there was nowhere to run this time. The whispering grew louder, more voices joining in, until it was a chorus, like 100 voices all calling my name. The fog seemed to take on a life of its own, twisting into shapes that almost looked like people. Shadows with no substance. They moved closer, surrounding me, their forms flickering and shifting like they were made of smoke. I backed away until I bumped into something solid. I turned around and found myself standing right in front of the statue again. Only now it was different. It wasn't stone anymore. It was flesh. The thing standing in front of me was alive, its skin pale and rubbery, stretched tight over a gaunt, skeletal frame. Its eyes were wide and black, staring into mine with a horrible intensity, as if it was trying to peel back the layers of my mind and see what was inside. Its mouth, that awful grin, was still there, but now I could see rows of needle-like teeth behind its cracked lips. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The thing reached out toward me, its long fingers curling around my wrist. Its touch was ice cold, burning into my skin like frostbite. I could feel a wave of nausea and dizziness washing over me, like my very life was being drained away. Then, just as quickly as it began, it stopped. The fog receded, and I was back on the dirt path. My car was there, right where I'd left it. There was no sign of the lantern, the stone circle, or the pile of clothes. It was like nothing had happened. But when I looked down at my wrist, I saw a deep bruise forming where the thing had grabbed me. Black and purple, shaped like a hand. I didn't wait around to see what else might happen. I jumped into the car, floored the gas, and didn't stop driving until I was well out of the woods. But even as I got back on familiar roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't really escaped. I felt hollow, like something was missing, like a piece of me had been left behind in that place. Or worse, that something had followed me out. I went back to my apartment, not knowing what else to do. I was exhausted, physically and mentally, but there was no way I could sleep. The bruise on my wrist kept getting darker, spreading up my arm like some kind of infection. I could still hear the whispers in the back of my mind, even when there was no sound. And then, just as I thought things couldn't get any worse, I saw it. The statue was in my living room, standing in the corner, its eyes fixed on me with that same twisted grin. But this time, it wasn't stone, and it wasn't flesh. It was a shadow, a dark, featureless silhouette, flickering like a candle's flame. It was closer than it had ever been before, and as I stared at it, I realized the whispers were coming from inside me now, echoing in my own voice. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the thing, paralyzed with fear. But eventually, the shadow began to fade, melting into the darkness of the room, leaving me alone again. Alone with the realization that there was no escaping this. Whatever I had unleashed, it wasn't going to let me go. It was a part of me now, woven into the very fabric of my being. I keep hearing it call my name, even now. Sometimes it's a whisper, other times it's a scream, but always it's there. I don't know if I'm still in those woods or if I ever left. I don't know if I'm alive or if I've become something else. All I know is that it's getting closer, and when it finally reaches me, I'm not sure if there'll be anything left to save. Days blurred into each other after that night, and sleep became impossible. When I closed my eyes, I saw it, whatever was waiting for me on the other side of my eyelids. Its whispers crawled into my dreams, twisting them into visions of darkness and decay. I kept hearing my name, echoing through the halls of my mind like a voice calling me home. But where was home now? My apartment felt alien, the shadows too deep, the silence too heavy. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me from the corners, just out of sight. It was like the walls themselves had eyes, always observing, waiting for the right moment to move in closer. The bruise on my wrist had spread to my hand, dark veins snaking up my arm. The skin felt tight and cold, almost like it was becoming something else, something not entirely human. I tried to go about my life, keep things normal. I didn't want to tell anyone what was happening. I mean, how could I even begin to explain it? It wasn't just that I thought people would think I was crazy. It was that saying it out loud would make it real. It would mean admitting to myself that I had brought something back from that place, and that I had no idea how to get rid of it. I had to know more, though. I couldn't just let this thing, whatever it was, consume me without a fight. So I went back online, digging deeper into those forums about the cult, the rituals, and the old stories connected to that part of the woods. There was one name that kept coming up over and over again: the Hollow Man. Some said he was a demon, others a spirit cursed to wander the earth, feeding off the fears of the living. But the most unsettling stories were the ones that claimed he was neither living nor dead. Something in between, something that could move between worlds, dragging souls along with him. The statue, according to some of these old tales, was a vessel, a doorway, almost, that connected our world to wherever the Hollow Man came from. By touching it, by interacting with it, I had essentially invited him in. Some of the forum posts warned that once the Hollow Man had his sights set on you, there was no way to shake him loose. He would cling to you, slowly eroding your mind, feeding on every moment of fear and despair. And the worst part was, you wouldn't even realize what was happening until it was too late. You'd just wake up one day and find yourself somewhere else, someplace dark and hollow, never to return. Reading those stories only made things worse. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes they'd seem to come from outside my apartment, like someone was standing just outside the door. I'd run to check, but of course, there was never anyone there. Just that same empty hallway, stretching out like a tunnel. And each time I opened the door, I felt a cold draft, like air coming from someplace much deeper than the stairwell. Then one night, something happened that pushed me over the edge. I was sitting on the couch, trying to distract myself with the TV. I don't even remember what was on, just background noise to drown out the silence. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was so quiet at first that I thought I was imagining it. But then it grew louder, more rhythmic, like fingers drumming on a wooden table. I muted the TV and listened. The tapping was coming from the other side of the wall. I got up, pressing my ear against the wall, trying to figure out if it was coming from the neighbor's apartment. But as I stood there, I noticed something strange. The tapping wasn't coming from the wall itself. It was coming from behind it, from a space that shouldn't have been there. And then I heard it, a voice clearer than it had ever been before, whispering my name. I jerked away from the wall, my heart pounding. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, the apartment was silent again, except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. But then, I saw it, movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, and there, in the dim light of the hallway, I saw a shape standing just inside my bedroom door. It was tall and impossibly thin, its outline shimmering like a heat mirage, as if it wasn't fully there. I could make out its eyes, two black pits in a face that seemed to flicker like a candle's flame. I froze, my mind racing. Was this the Hollow Man? Was this the thing that had followed me home? It just stood there, staring at me with that twisted grin, and I could feel a cold dread spreading through my chest, as if it was reaching inside of me, trying to pull something out. I backed away slowly, not daring to take my eyes off it. But the further I moved, the closer it seemed to get, even though it never actually moved. Without thinking, I ran into the bathroom and locked the door behind me. I sat on the floor with my back against the door, trying to steady my breathing. I could hear faint footsteps outside, shuffling down the hallway, and then the voice again, right outside the door, speaking in a tone that was almost soothing, like it was trying to coax me out. "Come back, Jamie. It's time." I didn't open the door. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too scared to move, until the voice finally faded away and the apartment fell silent once more. When I finally worked up the courage to come out, the hallway was empty. But there was something new on the wall, right outside the bathroom door. Another bruise, a dark handprint etched into the plaster. It was the same size as the one on my wrist. That was when I knew I had to go back. Back to the house. Back to the cellar where I'd found the statue. Whatever had started there needed to end there. It was the only place I could think of where I might be able to face this thing, whatever it was, and try to sever the connection once and for all. I didn't have a plan, really. Just a gut feeling and a growing desperation that wouldn't let me sit still any longer. Then came the day I found the doorway. I hadn't noticed it before. It was just a closet door in the hallway that I'd walked past 1,000 times. But one evening, as I was pacing back and forth, trying to calm myself down, I felt a draft of cold air seep through the cracks around the doorframe. It was unusual. There shouldn't have been any air moving in or out of there. My curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly reached for the doorknob. As I pulled the door open, I was met with a darkness that was different from any shadow I'd ever seen. It was deep, almost alive, like it was absorbing all the light around it. I shined a flashlight into the space, expecting to see the usual clutter of a storage closet, but there was nothing. It didn't make sense. It should have been a shallow closet, but as the light cut through the dark, it revealed a staircase spiraling downward, leading far below the building. I stood there, staring at the steps that seemed to descend into infinity, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. There had never been a staircase there before. I'd lived in this apartment for years, and I knew every inch of it. But this was something else. It was like the space had shifted, changed itself to reveal this hidden passageway. Against my better judgment, I took a step onto the staircase, then another. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight. The walls, if there even were walls, seemed to close in around me as I descended. The stairs went on for far longer than they should have, longer than the height of the building. It was as if I was walking into a place that existed outside of space and time. At the bottom, I found a narrow hallway lined with old, wooden doors on either side. They were all different shapes and sizes, some barely more than a crawl space and others tall enough to reach the ceiling. Each door had a small window near the top, but the glass was covered in a thick layer of grime. There were no signs, no markings, nothing to indicate where they led or why they were there. As I approached the first door, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The whispers were louder now, more distinct, coming from behind the doors. I hesitated before reaching for the handle, a deep dread gnawing at me, but I had to know. I had to see what was on the other side. I turned the knob slowly and pushed the door open. Inside was a room much like my own living room. Only it was wrong. Everything was there. My couch, my coffee table, even the scratches on the floor, but it was as though the room had been abandoned for decades. Dust hung thick in the air, and mold crept along the walls. It was as if I was looking at some decayed reflection of my life, a version of my apartment that had aged without me. I closed the door quickly, my heart pounding. I tried the next one, and the next. Each room was a distorted copy of a place I knew. Places from my past, my childhood bedroom, the kitchen of my old house, a classroom from high school. They were all different, but each had that same feeling of decay, of something having lived there and then abandoned it long ago. The more doors I opened, the more familiar places I found, each twisted in its own way, as if someone or something was trying to mimic my life, but couldn't quite get it right. Finally, at the end of the hallway, there was one last door. Unlike the others, this one was plain, no window, no handle, just a solid black surface. I pressed my ear to it and immediately recoiled. The whispers were louder than ever, angry, desperate. They were calling my name over and over like a chant. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But I had come this far, and something was pulling me toward it like a magnet drawing in metal. I pushed on the door, and to my surprise, it swung open easily. Inside was a small, circular room with stone walls, like an ancient cellar. In the center was the statue. No, not just a statue, but the same grotesque figure I had left in that decaying house, fully intact and even more lifelike than before. Its eyes seemed to track me as I stepped into the room. Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, and the whispers became a deafening roar. The shadows around the room began to shift and swirl, taking shape. I saw figures emerging from the darkness, thin, pale forms with hollow eyes, all staring at me. They moved closer, closing the circle. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The statue's mouth opened wide, and I felt a pull like it was drawing me in. It was then I realized this wasn't just a haunting. It wasn't something that had followed me back from that house. It was something that had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for me to notice. And now I had walked right into its trap. The last thing I remember is a sensation of falling, like the ground had opened up beneath me and I was plunging into darkness. The voices were still there, whispering as they faded away, leaving me in an abyss so deep that there was no bottom, no light, nothing. When I woke up, I was back in my bed. The apartment was quiet, everything exactly as it should have been. But I knew something had changed. I could feel it in the air, in my own skin. The tapping had stopped, the whispers were gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, deep inside that darkness, a part of me was still trapped. And every now and then, when the night is particularly quiet, I swear I can still hear that faint voice calling my name. I kept telling myself it was over. Whatever had happened in that hidden cellar, whatever I'd unleashed was gone. But the feeling never really went away. It was like a dull ache that lingered just beneath the surface, a constant reminder that something had changed and I couldn't quite put it back the way it was. Days passed, then weeks. I went back to work, tried to regain some sense of normalcy. I even managed to convince myself that it had all just been some kind of breakdown, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. I figured that if I could just ignore it, if I could just keep myself busy enough, then it would all fade away like a bad dream. But then one night, I heard the whisper again. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It was coming from inside my apartment, just like before. This time, though, there was no tapping on the windows, no shifting shadows or moving objects. It was just my name, spoken in a voice that sounded disturbingly familiar, almost like my own. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I listened for what felt like hours, but there was nothing else, just that single whisper that seemed to echo inside my head long after it had gone silent. I tried to push it out of my mind, but sleep never came that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the whisper to come back. The next day, I noticed something odd. When I looked in the bathroom mirror, my reflection seemed off. It was subtle, but I swear the expression staring back at me wasn't quite right. It was like looking at a photograph that had been slightly distorted, just enough to make you uneasy, to make you question what you were really seeing. I rubbed my eyes, splashed water on my face, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like my own reflection was staring just a bit too long, holding eye contact even when I looked away. After that, things started happening more frequently. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the mirrors, just out of the corner of my eye, flashes of dark shapes darting behind me, disappearing as soon as I turned my head. It wasn't just the bathroom mirror either. It was every reflective surface in the apartment. It got to the point where I began covering them up, draping towels and sheets over them, anything to keep from seeing my own face looking back at me. But the whispering, that didn't stop. It got worse, clearer, like it was growing stronger. It wasn't just saying my name anymore. It was talking to me, repeating phrases over and over, phrases I didn't understand. Sometimes it would laugh, a low, distorted chuckle that made my skin crawl. Other times, it would scream, a guttural, animalistic sound that seemed to rattle the very walls of my apartment. Yet, whenever I played back recordings, there was nothing, just silence. Then came the night when everything fell apart. I was sitting in my living room, staring blankly at the TV, not really watching anything, just trying to drown out the noise in my head. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the darkened TV screen, I could see the outline of a figure standing in the hallway behind me. It was barely there, just a faint silhouette, but it was unmistakable. It was tall, hunched over, with arms that seemed to stretch impossibly long. Its face was blank, a smooth expanse of darkness where features should have been. I turned around, but of course there was nothing there. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. When I looked back at the TV, the figure was gone, but the whispering had returned, louder than ever. "Look closer," it said, the voice practically vibrating through the room. "You know what you did?" The word struck me like a physical blow. I felt a wave of nausea, my stomach twisting painfully. I didn't know what it was talking about, but deep down, I felt that familiar sense of dread creeping back in. I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. I ended up driving aimlessly around the city for hours, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But no matter where I went, I felt that same presence, like something was following me, watching from just beyond the edge of my vision. I finally pulled over at a gas station and sat in the car for a long time, just staring at the steering wheel. As I sat there, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. At first, it was just a smudge, a small dark spot near the center. But as I stared at it, the smudge seemed to grow, spreading out across the glass. It wasn't just a shadow. It was more like a hole, an absence of light that seemed to be swallowing everything around it. And then, from within that darkness, I saw a face, my own face, staring back at me with a look of pure, unfiltered terror. I blinked, and it was gone. Just my own reflection again, pale and sweaty, eyes wide with fear. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't know what was happening to me, but I knew I couldn't go back to the apartment. Not yet. I needed answers. I needed to know what had started all of this. I thought back to the house, to the cellar, to the statue I had found there. It all seemed to come back to that place. I didn't want to go back there, but I knew I had no choice. If I was ever going to put an end to this, I had to face it, to confront whatever it was I had disturbed. When I arrived at the house, it was just as I remembered it. Abandoned, decaying, the air thick with that same heavy, oppressive feeling. The front door was still unlocked, swinging open easily as I stepped inside. The smell of dust and rot filled my nostrils, and the floor creaked under my weight as I made my way toward the cellar door. The stairs seemed longer this time, each step echoing loudly in the silence. When I reached the bottom, the small circular room was exactly as I had left it. The statue still sat in the center, its grotesque form looming over me like some dark idol. But there was something different this time, something I hadn't noticed before. There were markings on the walls, faint symbols etched into the stone, glowing dimly in the darkness. As I approached the statue, the whispers began to swell, rising in a chaotic chorus that seemed to come from all directions. I reached into my bag and pulled out the old book I had found during my research, an ancient text that described rituals and banishments, ways to sever connections to the otherworldly. I had no idea if it would work, but it was my only hope. I started the ritual, chanting the words from the book, drawing the symbols as best I could from the faded illustrations. The air around me seemed to thicken, vibrating with an unseen energy. As I recited the final incantation, the whispers reached a fever pitch, and the darkness around the room seemed to coalesce, swirling toward the statue like a storm. The statue's eyes suddenly flared to life, glowing with a deep, unsettling red, and I felt a force push back against me, like the room itself was resisting. Objects began flying through the air, smashing into the walls. The shadows twisted and contorted, forming shapes that writhed and clawed at the edges of the light. Just when it seemed like the ritual was failing, the energy in the room shifted. There was a loud crack, like the sound of stones splitting, and the statue began to crumble, pieces of it falling away like dried mud. The whispers fell silent, and for a moment, I felt a wave of relief, like the pressure that had been bearing down on me had finally lifted. But then, from the darkness beyond the broken statue, I heard it, that same familiar whisper, only this time it was coming from right behind me. I told you, it breathed, the voice dripping with malice. There's no way back. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. It felt like hours before I could bring myself to leave that place, to climb back up those stairs and return to the surface. When I finally stepped outside, the air felt lighter, cleaner. I took a deep breath and told myself it was over. But now, as I sit here writing this, I can hear it again, a faint tapping at the window. And in the darkened reflection of the screen, I swear I can see something moving behind me. I froze, my eyes glued to the darkened screen, straining to make out the shape behind me. It was faint, like a trick of the light or a shadow cast by a passing car. But as I watched, it became clearer, slowly shifting into focus. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the room, still and silent, its form barely discernible in the dim light. I didn't dare turn around. Every instinct I had told me not to look directly at it, to pretend it wasn't there, to just keep my eyes forward. But then the tapping at the window grew louder, more insistent, and the figure took a step closer. I could see it moving now in the reflection, its limbs bending in strange, unnatural angles, the darkness around it seeming to cling to its form like a shroud. It wasn't quite human, or maybe it was once. Its body was gaunt and distorted, like something that had been stretched and pulled in all the wrong directions. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, spreading through my body like ice. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. Then the voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a low, raspy croak coming from the figure in the reflection. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, the words echoing in the quiet of the room. "You belong to us now." I could feel my heart hammering against my chest. Slowly, I turned my head, my body moving on its own despite the overwhelming terror. But when I looked behind me, the figure was gone. The room was empty, just as it had been before. There was nothing at the window, no sign of anyone or anything having been there. It was as if the figure had vanished into thin air. But I knew it wasn't over. The tapping had stopped, but the air was still thick, heavy with a presence that I couldn't see. I felt it watching me, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I grabbed my jacket and stumbled toward the door, practically tripping over myself in my rush to get out. I had to get away, to put as much distance between me and whatever was in that apartment as I could. I didn't know where to go. I just kept walking, wandering the empty streets, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. I could feel it following me, its eyes on me, no matter how fast I walked or how many turns I took. It was there, just out of sight, always a step behind. The city seemed different somehow, quieter than usual. The streetlights flickered as I passed, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. I found myself drawn back to the park near my apartment, a small patch of trees and grass that seemed even darker at night. It wasn't where I wanted to be, but my legs felt like they were moving on their own. I stopped at the edge of the park, staring into the darkness between the trees, half expecting to see the figure emerge from the shadows. I listened, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no whispers, not even the sound of the wind. I thought I was alone. But then, as I turned to leave, I saw something strange out of the corner of my eye. An old wooden bench, sitting just beyond the tree line, almost hidden in the shadows. I hadn't noticed it before, but there was something about it that felt familiar. It looked worn and faded, the wood splintered and cracked with age, as if it had been sitting there for decades. And on the bench was an object, a small, crumbling statue that I recognized immediately. It was the same statue I had found in the cellar, the same grotesque figure that had haunted my nightmares. But how had it gotten here? I had seen it crumble to pieces during the ritual, had watched it break apart and turn to dust. Yet here it was, as solid and real as the night around me. I approached it slowly, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch it. As my fingers brushed against the cold stone, I felt a jolt, like an electric shock coursing through my body. The air around me seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and a voice echoed in my head, louder than before, filling my mind with a terrible certainty. You never left. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. I turned to run, but the world around me seemed to shift, the park stretching and warping, the trees bending in impossible directions. The ground seemed to tilt beneath my feet, and I fell to my knees, my vision blurring as the darkness closed in. I tried to stand, but it felt like I was sinking, like the earth itself was swallowing me whole. The voice grew louder, almost deafening, a chorus of whispers and screams that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I felt like I was being pulled in 100 different directions, like my very soul was being torn apart. I could see shapes moving in the darkness, figures just like the one I had seen in the reflection, their twisted forms circling me, drawing closer with each passing moment. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The ground beneath me was solid again, the trees were still, and the park was just as it had been before. But I knew that something had changed, that I wasn't the same person who had walked into that park. I could feel it deep inside, a darkness that wasn't there before, something that had followed me back from that place. When I finally made it back to my apartment, it felt different. The air was colder, the shadows deeper. I kept telling myself that I had escaped, that whatever had happened in the park was just another hallucination, a product of my unraveling mind. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home that night, that it's still here, hiding in the corners of the room, waiting for the right moment to show itself. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that faint tapping at the window. It's softer now, almost polite, like it's asking permission to come inside. And in those moments, I catch glimpses of movement in the darkened mirrors, shapes that don't quite look like my own reflection. And when I close my eyes, I hear that voice again, clearer now, closer. You belong to us, it whispers. You've always belonged to us. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. I don't know if there's anywhere I can go where it won't follow. I keep the lights on, cover the mirrors, do everything I can to avoid the shadows. But deep down, I know it's only a matter of time before it finds a way through. Before it pulls me back into that darkness from which there is no escape. It's hard to explain what it feels like to know your own mind is slipping, that reality is warping around you, and you can't trust what you see, hear, or feel. I don't know if I was losing my grip on sanity, or if something had genuinely followed me from that cellar. But the line between what was real and what was imagined was becoming impossible to distinguish. The nights were the worst. No matter how many lamps I turned on, how many candles I lit, the darkness always seemed to creep in. It would start in the corners of the room and stretch its way across the walls, the shadows reaching out like grasping fingers. I barely slept anymore, and when I did, my dreams were filled with images of that twisted figure and the whispers that had long since stopped sounding human. One night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard the familiar tapping again, but it wasn't coming from the window this time. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, like the entire apartment was alive with that terrible sound. It grew louder and more frantic, filling the air with a desperate, almost mournful rhythm. I couldn't stand it any longer. I threw off the covers and stumbled out of bed, my hands clamped over my ears. "Enough!" I screamed. "What do you want from me?" The tapping stopped. The apartment was silent again, unnaturally so. I stood there, my chest heaving, waiting for some response, but there was nothing. Just the heavy, oppressive quiet. I turned to head back to bed, but as I did, a soft voice broke the silence. It came from right behind me, so close I could feel the breath on my neck. "You know what you must do," it whispered. I spun around, but there was no one there. I was alone, but the words hung in the air like a command, echoing in my mind with an unsettling clarity. I knew then what I had to do. The only way to end this was to return to where it all began. The house, the cellar, the place where I had first touched that cursed statue. I had to finish what I'd started. I didn't waste any time. I threw on a jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and headed out the door. The night air was bitterly cold, the kind that stung your skin and made it hard to breathe. As I drove back to that house, the streets seemed deserted, like the entire world had gone into hiding. The journey felt longer than it should have, the road stretching endlessly into the darkness. But eventually, I reached the old, decrepit house at the edge of town. It looked even worse than I remembered, as if it had decayed further in the time since I had last been there. The front door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind, inviting me in. I stepped inside, and the smell of mildew and rot hit me like a wall. The air felt thick again, the same oppressive feeling I had experienced the first time I had come here. It was as if the house was alive, breathing, waiting. I made my way to the cellar door, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. As I descended the stairs, the darkness seemed to deepen, swallowing the weak beam of my flashlight. The cellar was just as I had left it, small, circular, the stone walls covered in faint symbols that glowed ever so faintly. But now, the crumbled remains. Thank you for joining me on Creepy Horror Tales. If you enjoyed the spine-chilling stories, please like this video and subscribe for more terrifying tales. I'd love to hear from you. Comment below with the part that scared you the most. Your feedback helps us bring you even more horrific and spooky content. Until next time, stay spooky.